Are you satisfied with the finished product?
Well, it's as good as anybody that makes a film who can't act, you know.
Ordinary, respectable citizens. Let's not cause any trouble, pull any strokes, or do anything I'm going to be sorry for, especially tomorrow in that television theatre, because... Are you listening to me, Lennon?
You're a swine, ain't George?
You're a swine.
Thanks.
Excuse me, have you seen that little old man we were with?
Broken out the blessed freedom of it all. Have you got a nail file? These handcuffs are killing me. I was named, I'm innocent, I don't want to go.
Sorry for disturbing you, girls.
I bet you can't guess what I was in for.
Good morning, mein Herr. Können Sie noch einen Tee haben? Oh, Britannia, Britannia rules the... Help me! Headphones! Help me! Help!
Tell me, how did you find America?
Turn left to Greenland.
Let us hear a few words about the awful.
I was bored on the 9th of October 1940 when I believe the Nasties were still booming us, led by Madolf Heatlum, who only had one. Anyway, they didn't get me. I attended Tavaricus schools in Liverpool and still didn't pass, much to my auntie's surprise. As a member of the most publified Beatles, my and PG and R's records might seem funnier to some of you than this book. But as far as I'm conceived, this correction of Short Richie is the best laugh I've ever ready. God help and breed you all.
I now declare this bridge open.
Glass onion.
John Lennon.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 103 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. And this is John Lennon the actor. In truth, we're going to be broadening out a little bit to John Lennon the performer, but we did cover that to some extent in an episode we did called John Lennon Live a couple of years ago. Anyway, who better to do a show about John Lennon the actor than a real actor, a professional thespian. So we've got here Ross Marshall. How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you, Anthony. And thanks for having me on. I'm a massive Lennon fan, and it's nice that we can do John Lennon the actor.
Yeah, he said lots of nice things about the show, which I appreciate. Right, so we've got a few bits to touch on here. We're going to be looking at John Lennon's acting roles, or one might say non-acting roles, perhaps. We'll get into that later. We're going to talk about acting itself, but we'd like to start with your show, which is on Amazon Prime. Is that a film?
Yeah, so it's a film. They take ages to come out. We filmed it a year ago. It's finally on Prime. Came out just over a week ago, and it's called Black Daruma. I'd say it falls under the category of dark comedy, although some might say horror, but it's not. I'm not a massive horror fan, and it doesn't feel like a full-blown horror film to me. It's more dark comedy with elements of horror. And I'll just give you a quick sentence about what it's about. It's basically about an unemployed guy who's not having the best of times. He buys this Japanese luck doll in an attempt to improve his fortunes, and I won't ruin it totally, but it doesn't quite work out too well. And it's interesting how it's filmed. It's shot through the eyes of the doll, so it's as if the doll is the camera, and it's just like an independent film, so it's not a massive budget. But I was surprised by it because I'm my own worst critic, but I actually enjoyed it. I've not got the main role in it. I'm in it for about 7 minutes or so, but it's quite a good role. All my scenes are in a row. I play a bit of a nutcase.
I think John Lennon would appreciate that, wouldn't he?
Yeah. But I thought I'd mention it's filmed through the eyes of the doll because my auntie failed to grasp that. And she went, I'd have liked it more if I'd have known that. So I have to keep telling people that now.
Would you call it quite experimental then?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back to acting in a bit, but can you tell us, this is something that I often ask guests, what's your John Lennon / Beatles origin story? And you want to talk about some of your favourite songs as well.
Yeah, so my Beatles origin story, it's really weird actually. So I remember it vividly. So my dad, we were in a record store in Chesterfield in about, I think it was 1985, called Hudson's. And my dad was buying records and he said, oh, you pick one for yourself, any in the shop. So he let me wander around the shop. I knew nothing about music. I was like 6 or 7. And I was just drawn. Can you remember the Beatles Rock and Roll album, volume 1 and 2?
Yeah.
Where they're coming off the plane and John Lennon's got that leather cap on. I can remember out of all the albums, that one just took my eye. But I wasn't looking at the Beatles. I don't know why. It's really weird at that age. I was just fascinated by how John Lennon looked in the leather cap. And I just said to my dad, I just picked it. I knew I wanted that one. I knew nothing about them. And I just said to my dad, I want this one, please. My dad went, oh, wow, you've got good taste. How did you know about the Beatles? I literally knew nothing about them. And I said, it was a tape we bought. And he bought it me. And I asked him if we could play it in the car on the way home. And I loved straight away, I loved John Lennon's voice straight away without knowing at the time it was his voice. Mm. There must be something massively charismatic about him for me to be drawn to him without even knowing who he was as a 6-year-old. And then from then on, a bit like you, I read all the books. I was a bit of an oddball at primary school because it wasn't fashionable then to like the Beatles and John Lennon like it is now. And yeah, I just became strangely obsessed as a young kid, just reading all the books on him. I bought every Beatles album and then went on to all the solo stuff.
Just before you carry on, I just want to mention, actually, you just triggered a thought in my mind, because I actually remember the first time I actually was attracted, if you like, to John Lennon. It was before I became a Beatles fan. My mum had the Hard Day's Night vinyl album. And if you remember the cover, so you've obviously got, they're like snapshots, aren't they? 4 of John on the top, then Paul, then George and Ringo. If you remember, or if the listeners want to look at the top left picture, it's John Lennon doing a kind of, I don't know if you call it a smirk, I don't know, a cheeky look. Yeah. And I just remember looking at that, and I didn't know who he was either, and thinking, I just love that. It just looks cocky and confident, but not too cocky, a bit cheeky. So he got away with it, isn't it? Because he never seemed too arrogant, confident without being arrogant.
Well, I'd say that was the height of his cheeky chappy stage, the Hard Day's Night. I think like everyone seemed to fall in love with him, the country at that stage, because it was after he'd done the People in the Cheap Seats, Clap Your Hands just after that. And he was thought of as this lovable rogue at that stage.
Yeah, I remember this funny memory, listening to a radio show, and it was the press conference they did at JFK Airport. The famous, we all wear wigs and you're going to get a haircut. I had one yesterday. Yeah. And there's a bit where he just says, it's a dirty lie.
Not all this talk that you represent some kind of a social rebellion.
It's a dirty lie.
Why does it excite you so much?
We don't know, really. After we form another group and be managers.
And it was just something about his accent. It's because it's that 60s Liverpool accent. It's one of those 60s accents that doesn't really exist. Like if you see like old Cockney guys in films from the 60s, that accent is so broad, it almost doesn't, maybe it does exist, but it's not the norm anymore.
No, they've changed so much. The Liverpool accent now, the working class Liverpool accent is really chavvy, whereas it didn't seem chavvy then. It felt more sort of, I don't know, comforting in a way, like this really weird, strange accent. And the same now, like with when you watch the old movies, the Cockney accent, like they all seem to speak like an exaggerated Michael Caine in the really old-fashioned movies, and that's a different accent.
Yeah, it's like, all right, mate. All right, mate, like that. Anyway, why are we talking about that? Yes, you want to talk about some favourite songs, John Lennon or Beatles?
Yeah, so I'm a bit like you. You always refer to it as the Holy Trinity, late 66, 67. A Day in the Life is actually my favourite Beatles song, but I don't class that as a Lennon one. I think it's more a joint one. My favourite that are predominantly Lennon would be similar to you, except I'd include Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But then, like you, I'd have I Am the Walrus, Strawberry Fields Forever. They're my favourite 3 Lennon songs, but there's so many I love. And then I've got a soft spot for If I Fell and There's a Place, because I think they show a really early vulnerable side in his songwriting. And then my favourite 2 Lennon solo songs that stand out, Woman, I love that song. I think it's like a beautiful love song. Yeah. And Mind Games. I absolutely love Mind Games.
What do you think of the Mind Games album? Because that obviously got a lot of hype. It seemed like Sean Lennon was really desperate to show everyone that it was a forgotten classic. But what do you think of that album?
I don't think it's one of the greatest albums. I think they've sort of over-egged the pudding trying to make out it was a classic a little bit. But I do love a couple of songs on it. I love, as I've just said, I love Mind Games. I love all the new versions where it's at the experimental stage. I also like Out the Blue on that album.
Oh, yeah. I like You Are Here. I think that's lovely. And David Spinosa's guitar, that really lush guitar all the way through. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I didn't realise how much I liked that song till the remake. I'd sort of forgot about that one a bit.
I think really good songs, when you strip them down, they get better because you see all the elements that make the great song, I think.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about acting. And I've got a bit of a vested interest because I did go to drama school, and of all the careers in the arts, I always thought the one I should have pursued was acting. I never thought I'd ever be a professional rock musician, not after about 16 years old anyway, but I do love acting. So do you want to give us a couple of your favourite actors?
Right. So my favourite actors tend to be sort of more the comedy actors. So like modern times, I love Steve Coogan. I think he's a bit of a genius, to be honest. The Alan Partridge character, I can't get enough. I could watch Alan Partridge forever. And then he was brilliant as Jimmy Savile in the recent documentary. So he can do serious roles and comedy.
Yeah.
Then I love John Cleese, Basil Fawlty. I love that character. And Monty Python stuff. Peter Sellers, not so much for his acting, but I'm fascinated by him as a person. So he was like an absolute nutcase. I've read quite a bit about him. Yeah. And I do love some of his acting performances. They're probably my favourite three because I tend to be drawn. So I write sitcoms, so I tend to be drawn to comedy actors. But also I like Caroline Aherne.
Oh,
do you remember her?
Yeah,
from
she died. Yes, sad. She died.
Yeah, she died a few years ago. I thought she was hilarious, and like Mrs. Merton and some YouTube sketches. She was brilliant.
Can I just do my quick Mrs. Merton impression?
Yeah, go on.
Let's have a heated debate. Because she had all these old people, didn't she? And
that's good.
They'd have heated debates, yeah.
Yeah, the audience was always old biddies, wasn't it?
Yeah. I love Alan Partridge as well. I mean, I think he's been quoted actually on this show. I don't know how. That was it. It was the famous "What's your favourite Beatles album?"
Tough one. I think I'd have to say the best of the Beatles.
Yeah. Do you know the Ringo story about Peter Sellers?
Well, they filmed. Is it The Magic Christian?
Yeah.
They filmed that together. I know a few stories from when they filmed together, but I may not know the one you've got in mind. So.
Yeah, I think you'll love this because obviously Peter Sellers and John Lennon, they met a couple of times famously. We'll talk about that when we get to Let It Be. Probably was some similarity perhaps in terms of complexity, but Ringo told this great story. He would go out after filming with Peter Sellers and he had an okay working relationship with him. They go out, have a few drinks, and he felt like he'd really bonded with him. But then he'd say the next day, I don't know, maybe Peter Sellers had a hangover, maybe not. It was like it had all been forgotten and he had to rebuild the relationship every day. And I thought it was such a good comment. It's interesting, isn't it?
I do vaguely remember that, actually. And that is interesting because Peter Sellers used to say he didn't know who he was. So he was like almost a different person. Like, we all love Lennon, obviously, but he did have a massive ego. And I think Peter Sellers had a massive ego as well. But ego is just vulnerability in a way. And I think that's what makes them both fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I do vaguely recall that Ringo story now you've said it.
Yeah, they talk in psychology of there's broadly three types of ego. There's the balanced ego, which is quite unusual, really. Just people who really seem to have it all together. The fragile ego and the large ego. And obviously the fragile ego and the large ego can go together because fragility can create a large ego. So yeah, I'm with you there. Let's talk about what are the broad acting styles? Can you be very broad? Because I'm sure there's 100 that you could mention, but think of just a couple.
Yeah, I mean, we could be here all day with that. I think people go too much into it. Oh, you're either a method actor or you do the Meisner. But I think you can do more than one depending on the scene and the role because certain things can work better for certain people at obviously certain times. I think just what fits best for you as a person. But there are so many different approaches. You've got the Meisner approach, which I tend to like the best if we're talking approaches, which is basically a truthful version of you under your imaginary circumstances. And then there's the approach that's more, people link it with Strasberg, which is sort of character acting and method acting, where rather than it just being a truthful version of you, you become a different character. And then you could take it a step further. I think Stella Adler's famous for this, where you create a backstory for your character.
Yes.
The best book I read on acting, it was like a common sense guide for actors. I think it was, I forget his name. Is it spelled Mamet? I don't want to pronounce it wrong. Yeah.
There's a writer called David Mamet. Is that the same person? Or
it may be, yeah. He basically promotes learn the lines, because it's so important. And that fits with how I feel about acting, because I think if you have the lines learned so well that it's not even a thought in your head, that's when the magic happens, because all the other stuff comes into play. Whereas I feel if you haven't got the lines, you won't be listening to the other person because you'll be nervous about getting your lines right. And I've always found when you haven't got the lines, you'll start blinking and you're not relaxed. Bizarrely, that works well if you're playing a bumbling, nervous character. It actually works in your favour. But in general, it's best to have the lines. So I think that's something that sounds obvious, but a lot of the time, because it's quite boring learning them, more than you'd think, actors aren't fully prepared with that, which is fine if it's impromptu stuff. And I actually enjoy that more because I like to think I can think quite quickly. But when it is a script, it's so vital that you get the lines down, I think.
Yeah, I remember a couple of bits of advice when I was at drama school. One teacher or tutor, whatever you want to call it, said, learn the lines well, but leave just enough risk that you might forget one, because it will just add a little bit more adrenaline intensity. The other one said, similar to what you said, learn them incredibly well and then leave it maybe a day or two before the performance, just so, you've got that little bit of distance. So there were a couple of bits of advice.
What I learned as well is random is instinct in its truest form. So it's good to be brave and not just stick rigidly to it. And usually a good director will allow that. You sometimes get them where they're a bit anal in terms of wanting you to stick exactly to the script, which is why it's good to have them.
I want to just quickly tell this story that I know you know and some of the audience might know, because I like to link to my other podcast. And we did a show about, I think we were talking about acting styles on Film Gold. And the famous story is Dustin Hoffman was making Marathon Man with Laurence Olivier. And basically, Dustin Hoffman plays someone who is a sort of an amateur marathon runner in the film, gets involved in some high-level stuff, and Olivier is famously a Nazi who's a dentist. And Dustin Hoffman decided that his character, if he wanted to portray his character not having had any sleep, it's best if he didn't have any sleep either. And he said it wasn't all bad because he used to go to Studio 54, that famous nightclub. So he hadn't slept for 3 days, and also he did a few laps of Central Park. And Olivier said to him, you're okay? And he goes, yeah, I'm really tired. I haven't slept for 3 days and I've been running for 2 hours. Olivier said, why don't you try acting, dear boy? Which is classic, isn't it? I mean, Hoffman's obviously taking the method to ridiculous levels. And Robert De Niro, of course, famously in Raging Bull did that as well. Put on the weight for real rather than wearing a fat suit. Yeah,
it just sums up two totally different approaches to it. So, Dustin Hoffman's taking it, really seriously, really getting in the role, and wants to come across as tired. So he is really tired. And then, why don't you try acting, old boy? That's just like, pretend to be tired. But, you can incorporate both.
And what's interesting about it is that if you take either side, you could say the other person's being lazy, because you could say, the guy who doesn't have lack of sleep or running is being lazy because he's just pretending, in inverted commas. But then someone else could say, well, you're being lazy, Dustin Hoffman, because you're not testing your skill of conveying it. You're doing it for real. So it's interesting. There's no right or wrong answer, obviously, is there?
Well, this is why I think learning the lines is so important, because if you've got that, all you have to do then is just in your head, it's real. So then no one can really criticize you, because if it's real in your own mind, you're just being natural. But if you haven't got the lines, it's harder to do that, obviously. There was one other thing, I'll be quite brief, that I learned from acting. And that was, which I never knew I'd learned this, and I found it fascinating. It was all about understanding your archetype and go with a negative archetype. So a negative part of your personality. So you had to have someone else tell you what it is. So one that really touches a raw nerve. And then if you go with that, it brings out like a vulnerability in your performance. Mine was, you come across as a bit thick. This is what I learned. And then if I go in with that, I'm a bit thick, even if I'm playing a professor who's meant to be highly intelligent, it still works because it brings something really different and interesting to the role. I think charisma is just being frightened to death and doing it anyway. So if you do a really nasty archetype and use it, it brings out a certain something. And that's what I got the most from drama school. I found it fascinating. A guy called Matt Zena taught me that, actually. I'll give him a little heads up.
Oh, very good, yeah. I know you're not a massive Marlon Brando fan, but he is my favourite actor. I realise we did a 2-part special on him on Film Gold, and we agreed that he definitely didn't have the best career, if you take the whole career, compared to a lot of other people. But there are just a couple of bits that he did. He said he didn't like to learn his lines too well because people don't learn their lines in real life. You and I, we've got some prompts, but we're not speaking lines. Hopefully this is coming across as spontaneous. I'm sure it is. The other thing he did was that because he had such a troubled upbringing, he had basically both parents were alcoholic, for example. And in the film Last Tango in Paris, there's a moment where his character starts talking about his mother and father. And he's essentially just talking about his mother and father for real. He changed a couple of details. Said, my father was a drunk, my mother was a drunk. And essentially, again, you could say that's lazy because he's just being Marlon Brando for that speech. But then he's not exactly doing that. He is changing it a little bit to fit the character. But that's what I always loved about him, because he's taken it to extremes.
I'm not a massive fan of Brando, but I am a big fan of him. Yeah, I like things like that as well, where you do something unexpected, because then you get a real reaction from the other person.
That's right.
And even though I'm sort of contradicting myself, I do get where he's coming from, where if you haven't got the lines, it brings out something more real and interesting. It's just that with me personally, it's a direction that's really strict with it. I'll find myself on edge if I haven't got the lines.
Just one more thing about acting broadly. What do you think about using non-actors in a film?
A lot of actors get riled by it. It's, especially when they've put the work in and got a degree and spent a fortune.
Of course.
A total non-actor get cast in the part. It's like, oh, cheers. It's like punching the face to them. But I think it has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantages is that it'll be quite a unique performance. They probably had no training whatsoever. So it'll be like quite raw and it'll give something different. And I think they've probably not been beaten up by the industry like a lot of us get. So they're probably not worn down like a real actor. So they'll just be probably fresher and more excited and give it a different type of energy. Yeah. But the negative side is you do definitely get something from going, even if you're natural, you do gain a lot from going to acting school. Most of the people that do end up getting paid for the work are naturals, but I think in general acting school helps. Okay.
Yeah, a couple of famous examples would be the drill sergeant in Full Metal Jacket. What was his name? Lee Ermey. Yeah, what happened was he was supposed to be an advisor for the drill sergeant, and he demonstrated the lines, and they were so good that Stanley Kubrick just said, well, I may as well just cast this bloke instead.
I am Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, your senior drill instructor. From now on, you will speak only when spoken to, and the first and last words out of your filthy sewers will be, sir. Do you maggots understand that?
Sir, yes, sir.
Bullshit, I can't hear you. Sound off like you got a pair.
Sir, yes, sir.
If you ladies leave my island, if you survive recruit training, you will be a weapon. You will be a minister of death praying for war. But until that day, you are the lowest form of life on earth. You are not even human fucking beings. You are nothing but unorganized, grabastic pieces of amphibian shit. Because I am hard, you will not like me. But the more you hate me, the more you will learn. I am hard, but I am fair. There is no racial bigotry here. I do not look down on niggers, kites, wops, or greasers. Here you are all equally worthless. And my orders are to weed out all non-hackers who do not pack the gear to serve in my beloved corps. Do you maggots understand that?
Sir, yes, sir.
Bullshit, I can't hear you.
Sir, yes, sir.
In The Deer Hunter, which is one of my favourite films, famously got a 45-minute wedding scene, which I absolutely love. I won't hear of that being too long. Of all the guys, you got Robert De Niro, John Cazale, Christopher Walken, etc. There's one guy, I can't remember his name, but his character's called Axel, and they're all steel workers. And obviously all the actors are doing a very good job of just appearing to be these kind of blue-collar steel workers in Pennsylvania. And then you got one guy who was a steel worker. But it's actually the way that they all fit together is amazing. I guess everyone gets credit for that. And then City of Gods, the Brazilian film, really, really good film. I don't know if all the actors were non-actors in that, but things like taking people from Brazilian favelas and just saying to them that you don't really need to do anything in particular, because I guess sometimes the non-actors, maybe they even say their own lines.
There will be a lot of people that are just naturally gifted and didn't realise until they got an opportunity, because I went to acting classes, but I never went to acting school as such. Like I haven't got a degree in performing arts or anything like that. And I got my first actor role when I was very inexperienced. I think it can work. The question you said about when they're doing their own lines, say, for example, that they've got the non-actor in because, like what you just said, the role is something close to their own life experience. I think it worked really well in that sense, because they wouldn't have to learn a new skill. They can just go with it.
Yeah, just behave as they normally behave in a sense, like in a favela, or wherever it is. That probably works better. Right, let's talk about John Lennon then. So before we go into his various acting and, let's say, performing roles, what attributes do you think he had as an actor? Because I know that you, common with me, and a lot of people would say that potentially he could have been a very, very good actor. So what attributes did he have, and what maybe made him unsuitable for the life of an actor? There's a nice question for you.
The case for him, the attributes that I think he had, this is one thing I find fascinating about John Lennon. I don't even know what he looks like. He's such a chameleon. He looks different all the time, which lends nicely to acting. Like I said, total chameleon. Is he a thug? Is he a wimp? You could make a case for both. A genius or a fool? A geek or cool? Is he handsome or not handsome? I won't say ugly, because he's definitely not that. Is he lazy or hardworking? Is he nasty or peace-loving? Is he funny or serious? Sometimes he even looks posh. Sometimes he looks rugged. Like, who the hell is he? Yeah. So that is perfect for an actor. He's such a curious character. So, yeah, he fits perfectly. And I think he fits with the Meisner approach really well, because he doesn't really have to become a different character, because he's a different character every 20 minutes. As himself, he changes so often. So he can just be a truthful version of him, at whatever mood or whatever given time of his life it is. Because he's such a fascinating character, and he uses charisma. So he got all the tools to be a fantastic actor.
But
so this is the book now, yeah. I think he struggled with boredom massively, especially during How I Won the War. I think I saw an interview an article where he used to hate all the waiting round, because I think he wrote Strawberry Fields partly waiting around to do his scenes.
Definitely, yeah.
So I think he'd struggled with that. And I think also he definitely had a lazy side. So I think he would have found it really boring, maybe learning the lines at times. This is just my own opinion. I think he'd be better when he's off the cuff, because I think he's quite a quick thinking and instinctive person. But I'm not sure. I don't know what you think, but I'd be interested to know what you think about this. I think for a brief period he was, but overall I don't think he was ever that passionate or interested in it. I think he was for maybe 2-3 year period, but I think How I Won the War maybe put him off it.
I think he was into films, because obviously him and Yoko made films, but he wasn't really acting necessarily. He was always behind the camera or just doing things like smiling, and they slowed the shutter speed down so his smile lasted 50 minutes or whatever. In my opinion, I think what makes him suitable, he had the life experience. And Michael Caine famously did an acting masterclass that you can watch on YouTube. It's a bit comical because he seems like he's half cut when he's doing it. And he's sort of going, acting is in the eyes, which is definitely a fair point. Often some people have particular eyes, like Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, these, in their case, blue eyes. And there's a lot of experience in there. And there is a story, I've never quite had this verified, that he used to think about his childhood when he was doing vocals, particularly emotional vocals. Like you can imagine, like with Dear Prudence or something like that, because it's a song with lots of sort of childhood imagery in it. So you can imagine having a close-up on him, and you can feel all the life experience and all the deaths he'd suffered in his eyes. I can imagine that. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. We both done our homework, haven't we? We watched lots of films and so forth. And I don't think that's ever been captured. I don't know. What do you think?
No, well, the eyes don't lie, do they? But he's never really done a really serious, hard-hitting acting role. So we'll probably, I think he could have done that really well, actually. But I suppose we'll never know. But that, that Michael Caine thing, he's obsessed with a certain eye looking at the camera. And I can remember watching that thinking, oh, bloody hell, how am I going to know which camera's nearest to me? Do you remember where he says, this eye on that part of the car? I thought, no, I can't be doing all that. I confused me. I love Michael Caine, though, but it confused me a bit, that.
Who's that guy who does impressions? Peter Serafinovich or something?
Oh, yeah.
He did a parody of... Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes just in case anyone's interested. A parody of Michael Caine's acting masterclass. The masterclass is almost a tiny bit of a parody anyway.
Interestingly, if you're doing a movie and you're smoking a cigar, like I am today, a cigar don't look like a cigar on a movie camera. Let me show you what I mean. Now look, there's my cigar. Now look at it through the monitor there, on the movie camera. See? Look at my cigar, look. See, it looks like a sausage. Yeah. In fact, has anyone got any sausages? Okay. Bring them up here. Okay. Now, hold them in front of the movie camera. Okay? Look at that on the monitor there. See? Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Looks like a lovely box of cigars. I don't know why it is. I think it's something to do with the lenses or something.
I've got a quote that I don't know if you'd heard it, but it fits with your last question. I wondered what you thought of this. John Lennon said, I want to be them all. Painter, writer, actor, singer, player, musician. And I'm lucky enough to be able to be them all. I want to see which one turns me on. It's an interesting quote. He did manage to be all them to an extent. But I think he said that when he did have a 2 to 3 year period where I think he was really interested in acting.
Yeah, but you could almost say the same about writing, because obviously he did publish a couple of books. But I always think had he lived beyond 1980, you might have got maybe a novel out of him at some point, something longer form. He seemed to have this thing where he struggled with attention. There has been a lot of, and I've been guilty of this, after the fact diagnoses of John Lennon, that perhaps he was bipolar, perhaps he had ADHD. I think he had some form of ADHD personally. And I think he seemed to, maybe it was insecurity, but he seemed to have a problem concentrating. They were keeping long hours in the studio doing whatever. I'm sure there was times where he was able to concentrate. But I think some of his acting roles, to be honest, he self-sabotaged with weed, with marijuana. We'll get onto it later, but quite a lot of the ones that we're talking about, to be honest.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think he potentially had bipolar, actually, from reading up on him.
Yeah, I mean, very possibly, yeah.
But these days, everyone's on the spectrum of something. It's more taken seriously, whereas back then it'd just be, stiff upper lip, just get on with it type mentality. So no one really took much notice of that type of stuff back in the 60s.
For sure. And of course, we didn't really have the term self-medicating then. Now people realise, someone like Amy Winehouse or someone was probably self-medicating a lot of the time. We talk about that now with John Lennon, but at the time we didn't really use that term.
He was always self-medicating on something, though, wasn't he?
I think so, yeah.
Not prescribed from the doctor, but...
Yeah, he said I always need a drug to survive, and I probably agree with that. The singer Nick Drake, his sister, who was an actress, she was in Crossroads, actually. She made her name in Crossroads, but Gabrielle Drake, she did lots of other things. She said to be a performer of any kind, you need a thin skin to access the feelings, and then a thick skin to deal with the industry.
That is so true. You like doing something you love and getting the high, but at the same time, sometimes when I'm walking to a role, I feel like I'm bloody walking to my death. I think, why the hell am I doing this? Because in a way, we're so sensitive actors. Like you said, it's part of it's the double-edged sword. Like you need that to do it well, but it's horrible having that. Anyway, I agree with it.
Yeah, so we're saying John Lennon, in conclusion, just on his general, we will get into specifics, but in his general acting potential, let's say, we definitely both agree that he had the potential because he had the life experience, he had the chameleon idea, as you said, and obviously a very kind of appealing face, if you like. He wasn't classically handsome, like Paul McCartney, for example, but yeah, it was good. Right, let's talk about his quote-unquote acting on stage. So what do you think of his stage patter? Did he have any stage patter, and what do you think of that?
Well, with this, I think we briefly discussed it. I don't actually think his stage patter was amazing. So I think he got very nervous on stage, particularly when it was just him, when it was him and Yoko. He was almost like apologetic when he wasn't prepared. And I think he was totally out of his comfort zone and got into a bit of a state with nerves in terms of the moments before songs and in between songs. However, when he was with the Beatles, I thought his stage patter was brilliant, almost bouncing off McCartney. Like McCartney was the straight man and he'd like fall around. So again, I think he was better when it was off the cuff, randomly doing a silly German accent or bizarre, he used to dart around in weird ways occasionally.
He obviously did all the stuff that people don't like now, the spastic movements and everything.
Yeah.
Stamp your feet and clap your hands. But that was a weird one because he was obviously living out this kind of obsession that he had with cripples and so forth. And no one's really got to the bottom of that. No, I'm not offended by it. I just think it's part of him. He's a weird guy, basically. Yeah. When you said about being nervous, were you thinking perhaps about the Toronto concerts? Because they were the last 2 regular episodes we did. Live Peace in Toronto, where he'd obviously been doing quite a lot of coke with Eric Clapton. So you've got coke and nerves together. But he sort of says, we're just going to do numbers that we know. Yeah, you're right. He is almost apologising.
Yeah, I was thinking of those. Yeah, he seemed very nervous on those. And also there's the one with Elton John where he was throwing up before he went on stage.
Yeah, and he's really wired, isn't he? Again, I don't know what he's wired on. He could have been just wired on adrenaline. I don't want to presume, but yeah, he's just like, they're doing it a million miles an hour, like the fastest version of whatever gets you through the night you've ever heard. Yeah.
So I think he got through on pure adrenaline sometimes. But yeah, they were in my mind. But I also think, his famous line, would the people in the cheap seats clap your hands and the rest of you if you just rattle your jewellery? I even think, even though it's iconic, I do think he seemed a bit nervy with that because that was more Paul's role usually. So I think his on-stage patter was brilliant when it was off the cuff and funny and random. But when the responsibility fell on him to present between songs, I think, he got very nervy. And like you said, the adrenaline was going. He was a bit erratic, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think their stage patter didn't really change too much. Like Paul's didn't. Paul did most of it, and then George and John did a bit of it. I'll just pick out a few things I like that he did. I like this sort of, I think it's supposed to be Japanese when he sort of go, oh yeah, slow down. I don't know what language it's supposed to be, but when he's at Shea Stadium, he does this thing where he's looking up and he's raising his hands to the sky. Yeah. And to me, he's just saying, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, how did this happen? There's a great quote where he says, you thought, what the hell's going on? The last thing I remember was playing music in the cavern, and now I'm here. So I think that reflects that. And then a couple of good lines when he's introducing Babies in Black, which is obviously in 3/4 time. He goes, it's a waltz for those of you over 10. And then another one, which I think is quite an interesting comment. They didn't like the way that their American albums were butchered, and that may be part of what the Butcher cover was all about. He says, this is off our latest LP album. I don't know what it's off. I haven't got it.
Yeah.
He's they're almost like making a point that I don't know which American album it's off because they've fucked around with our schedules or our track listings so much. So I like it when he got a little bit of that, almost a bit of a comment against the execs in there.
We'd like to do a slow song now, Rebecca. And it's also off Beatles 6 or something. I don't really know what it's off. I haven't got it. And it's a waltz, this one. Remember that. Anyway, the song's called Hopefully Enough. Look at that. It's called Babies in Black.
Yeah, that's typical Lennon.
It is.
And also that the Shea Stadium one you're talking about, that's the one where he manically plays the piano and he starts laughing with George Harrison, isn't it?
Yeah.
The same gig, I think.
Yeah.
There are some very funny moments that are just... And also what I used to find, he'd pull those weird faces as well when he got a bit nervy.
I think what happened with him was that I think he would probably say, and he probably did say, that Hamburg was the height of their performing because they did used to Max Schau, which obviously means make a show in Hamburg. But later on, they became what a guy in the Big Three called Shop Window Mannequins because Brian Epstein took on a band called the Big Three, who were a good band. did a great version of Some Other Guy, like a slow version. And he tried to get them to bow and do all that stuff. And it's interesting how the Beatles did change from being probably very raucous. We've only got photos, but there's a few photos from Hamburg where they're clearly on Prellies, and they're foaming at the mouth, So I think he was a performer for a while. And then for whatever reason, they just decided we're going to stand still, and he'd have his legs astride and his head back. I think also for him as a performer, give me your opinion about this. If you can't see, if you're short-sighted, I did a story ages ago about how I scored loads of goals when I was a kid because I was short-sighted, because it took the pressure off, because I couldn't see anything apart from the goal in the distance. What about short-sightedness for an actor? Would that help? Would that take the pressure off?
I think it adds to the mystique about him because it gives him a really interesting look, Lennon.
Definitely.
It's weird, isn't it? And I think it is to do with him being short-sighted. He's almost, when in reality he's probably struggling to see, it makes him look almost as if he's looking through people, or like an iconic stare. So I don't really know, but I could imagine it would work in an actor's favour.
I used to know this lady in Madrid, and she was a very unique young lady, and she was a performer, a really good songwriter. And someone described her, she always looked like she was just on another plane. And I think she did used to have a few drinks and smoke the odd herbal cigarette. But then I discovered after about a year of knowing her that she was completely short-sighted as well and wouldn't wear glasses. I thought it was so interesting. She was a bit Amy Winehouse and a bit Nico and a bit like a female John Lennon. But she was a fascinating character. But I think you're absolutely right. It gives them a weird look because they can't really see what they're doing. So they get that kind of hazy look. I think
it's like almost turning what's perceived as a weakness into a strength, basically.
Absolutely,
like a superpower.
Okay, we're going to get on to the first film in a second, but I'm going to sort of segue. I don't know if you've ever heard of Erin Torkelson-Weber. She was on the show about 3 years ago. She did a book about Beatles books. She talked about the Hard Day's Night narrative, which is what most people thought of as the Beatles. And the thing about the Hard Day's Night film, if you watch the Maysles Brothers film, that's got various titles, sometimes called The Beatles' First US Visit, it's almost the same. But let's talk about, just for a second, let's talk about their performances in front of the camera in press conferences and interviews. They clearly had this sort of repartee and they bounced off each other. What do we think of them in interviews? Because I think they really changed the nature of interviews. They turned them into performances, I think. Because I think before then, mostly you get people just saying, I've got a new record out in a couple of weeks. How do you feel about your next tour? I'm really looking forward to it. And the Beatles turned it into this kind of Marx Brothers style press conference. So what do you think of their press conferences and interviews generally, and John Lennon in particular?
Well, the early press conferences, they were like when everyone fell in love with them when they first went to America. They had like a witty answer for everything, and I think they were the lovable mop tops, cheeky chappies. And I thought Lennon was at the top of his game at that stage. He was just hilarious. He had an answer for everything. He was quick thinking, and I think he took centre stage at those press conferences. And then suddenly, in a relatively short period of time, they've got the long hair, the glasses, and stern, serious faces. It must have been, with the drastic appearance change, combined with them to talking about
Vietnam and
politics. It must have been a real shock to the people that grew up with them as the Fab Four to see them behaving like that.
Well, if you think about their press conferences as basically ending in 1966, obviously when they stopped touring, they still did interviews occasionally, but you never saw them do press conferences really. The difference between that first one at JFK in February 1964 and say August 1966 with the Bigger and Jesus, that's 2.5 years, and the tone is so different. I mean, they'd clown still occasionally, because I think they had certain interviews would ask them the same questions. They had a joke with this guy who'd say, what are you going to do when the bubble bursts? And they knew it was coming, and it was a good joke between them. But how different they are. But of course, in 1966, they're not really performing anymore in terms of the press conferences. They're actually just being serious, and they're not really the Marx Brothers anymore. Try to imagine the Marx Brothers if they were suddenly interested in social issues and commenting on the Vietnam War. I mean, that would seem crazy.
They still looked the same, except a bit thinner and obviously a couple of years older. But like you said, the mood was totally different, especially when there were the threats on the live with the Ku Klux Klan and everything. I think John was at his best looking. That's my favourite period for him, looking handsome in 66. So I love how he looks in those press conferences. And like you said, the tone and everything, it must have been so odd to see them going from just being jovial and jokey to discussing wars and death threats and politics.
It's so weird, isn't it? Yeah. I think that's it really with the press conferences. Just to say that in the first film, which we are going to get to in a second, folks, don't worry, they're being natural, but it's a natural repartee that they'd honed over 6 years. And George Harrison said everyone in Liverpool's a comedian. You know, it's like a survival thing almost. What used to happen in their early gigs was that if the electricity failed or whatever, George, because he'd been an electrician's apprentice, would fix the electrics, and John and Paul would do their repartee, their Nerd Twins act. Yeah. One of my favourite lines in the press conferences, and this actually came from George, this is absolutely brilliant. When they say, it's in Australia, the 4 of you millionaires, he goes, oh no, it's another lousy rumour. And he goes, is Brian Epstein a millionaire? Oh no, he isn't even, poor fellow. He said, well, where's all your money go? And they said, well, a lot of it goes to Her Majesty, meaning in tax. And George just says, she's a millionaire.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Which you think would probably have to have been spontaneous because they didn't really know that they were going to ask where all their money went. Who knows if they had it prepared? I don't know. All right, here we go, folks. We're going to go through films and sketches featuring John Lennon and sometimes the Beatles. Hard Day's Night. I'll just make a couple of comments, then I'll throw to you, and then I'll fill in whatever we've got left. I've actually got quite a few notes on this. I was on a podcast called The Classic Film Jerks a few years ago. They kind of celebrate / make fun of old films. And unfortunately, after being on that show, I really enjoyed it. But some of the things they pointed out about Hard Day's Night did actually lower my opinion of the film. I still really like it, but it's a film that has stars who clearly don't act. Well, they're kind of acting. Again, let's go back to this kind of acting. The obvious comparison, as we said, is with the Marx Brothers. And I think John Lennon was set up as Groucho, with maybe Paul as Chico, as the heartthrob of the Marx Brothers. Go on, you go first.
Well, I'm probably different to you in this because I've watched them all for this podcast. I actually hadn't seen the film for probably 20 years. So it felt like I was watching a new film, really. So it was so long ago since I'd seen it. And it was actually better than I remembered. I know what you're saying about them not acting, but I think all four of them did well. So it's not easy to play like an exaggerated version of yourself sort of thing. With the Marx Brothers, I'm not an expert on them. I know a little bit about them. Maybe you are on something with that. But I know I loved the film, and he looks cool in that film. I think he's very funny. And he plays like the cheeky chappy, a bit of a rebel. And I think he really carries it off. He's witty. He's still the trouble causer. And I think they give him all these cool traits to really sort of home in on sort of thing. I think he does a good job.
Yeah, when I was in this show, what they do is one of the sections of the show, they recast. They imagine the film's being made now and recast it with modern actors. And funnily enough, the only person I couldn't recast was John Lennon. We came up with Timothy Chalamet, who's obviously now playing Bob Dylan. But I said, you need someone who's basically a cheeky chappy, but with just a little bit of threat. Yeah. They said that's a really good description. That's a good description of John Lennon, because that's what he's doing here. Because he got some stuff like, remember when he's sniffing the Coke bottle?
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously a cocaine reference. And I mean, that's not him. Apparently hardly any of it was improvised. But the one line they took from him was they said, oh, how was Sweden? Oh, it was a room in a car and a plane in a car and a hotel in a car. Is there any bits you can remember, like lines or...
Yeah. Well, there's some really telling bits. I was going to mention the reference to snorting coke, because it's not really talked about that they did that at that stage, but obviously they were aware of it. And he does that a couple of times in it. And there's also some bits where the early references to him being the troublemaker. There's one bit where he goes off with an attractive girl. I don't know the actor's name, attractive lady, and he goes, she's going to show me a stamp collection.
Yeah.
I love the scene where he's in the bath. It's very John Lennon. I think he probably got this from Julia, because Julia used to have glasses with no lenses in, walk around Liverpool, and he's in the bath with his hat still on and all soap on his hat.
Oh yeah, she used to rub her eyes, didn't she? His mother. You can see where he got so much of it from. Yeah. If you know anything about his mother and father, even if they didn't have a home life.
Yeah. So just the eccentric behaviour. So I think that was probably his idea of keeping his hat on with soap all over it. And he does the German voice when he's in the bath, and there's references to the war, which obviously became part of his life with his always saying he's give peace a chance phase. I love the scene where she goes, "You don't look like him at all." It's like a flirty scene.
Yeah, Anna
And
Quayle.
he goes,
That's his. They all had a bit of a solo scene.
Come out, lads. First floor and no messing about. Lennon, put them girls down or I'll tell your mother of you.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, wait a minute. Don't
No,
tell
I'm
me
not.
you are. Oh, you are.
I'm not.
Oh, you are. I know you are.
I'm not now.
You look just like him.
Do I? You're the first one that said that ever.
Yes, you do. Look.
No, my eyes are lighter. All right, Noddy.
Oh,
My nose.
Yes, your nose is very.
Is it?
Well, I would have said so.
Oh, you know him better, though.
I do not. He's only a casual acquaintance.
That's what you say.
What have you heard?
It's all over the place.
Is it? Is it really?
But I wouldn't have it. I stuck up for you.
I knew I could rely on you.
Thanks.
You don't look like him at all.
She looks more like him than I do.
I have to disagree with this thing where people said Paul was the worst actor, and that was why his solo scene got cut. I think he was fine. You know, I can't see a big difference. For me, I think Ringo is the best actor, or the closest to being a movie star, because he's playing a kind of a sad sap, which is the role he played in the Beatles. You know, it's not necessarily true. John said Ringo was very wise, but in a kind of uneducated way, because obviously Ringo wasn't at school at the time because he had peritonitis and lots of illnesses.
I wrote it down actually. I thought that was the best scene where Ringo's. I think he was hungover in real life, where he was with the little lad near the Thames. I think. Yeah, it was very natural that scene. I'm obviously biased because I love him, but I think John Lennon was the best in it, followed by Ringo. But I thought Paul and George were both fine. Paul, like you said, I'd got into it thinking he was going to be terrible from what I'd read, but he was actually good. I thought Paul was good in it.
Yeah. There's a few bits in Help, which we'll get to, which I really like him. You've got the press conference. Remember when the girl says, have you got any hobbies? And he writes down.
Oh, yeah.
And probably John, again, this is probably a thing where they didn't tell him what to write down. You don't need to. And she looks shocked. And I think the bit in the bath, clearly they're not lines, are they? He's obviously improvising that.
And then he just comes out, he looks in the bath and he's gone. And then he just turns up, doesn't he? In his dressing gown, saying we're ready to go.
Yes, there's a couple of bits of surrealism, actually. Do you remember in the train, they're in the compartment with the old, maybe he's a war.
Then they're outside the train.
They're outside the train going, Mister, can we have our ball back? So you actually think, with your actor's hat on, you actually think their performances are not bad?
No, I think, because it's not as easy as people think to sort of just play yourself. I thought they're not amazing performances because it was the first venture into acting they'd done. Because I read that Paul tries too hard, but I don't think he did. I'm like you, I thought it was all right. But the standouts for me were John and Ringo, but I thought all four of them were good.
They were all given fairly good lines as well. I mean, Alan Owen wrote it. He famously wrote a play called No Trams to Lime Street. Here's another question. If you're Norman Rossington or John Junkin or Victor Spinetti, I don't know if you've ever acted with non-actors, but is there any particular, is it easier or harder, or does it, imagine the acting with the Beatles would probably be okay because they're just fun, aren't they?
Yeah. It's such a British film in it as well, with all the surrealism and everything. I don't think it really makes a difference because if you do a certain approach to acting, you just react to what the other character's giving you. So if you get a non-actor, it'll just be a different type of reaction, really. Obviously, when it's a non-actor, you might think, "Oh, come on, give me something." Because when you've got a really good actor, they make you look better. That's the beauty of it. So in that sense, it would be different.
But what I'm saying is really, what we're saying is the Beatles had been acting for a few years, even if they're not acting in films. They had an act. They were performers and actors, really, just not in a technical way. What else have we got here? Obviously, the other thing they're playing is they're almost playing teenagers in a way. I don't know how old they're supposed to be in the film. I mean, George was actually just 21, so he's still pretty young. They're also playing these kind of sexless Beatles. Yeah, he takes a girl off. But, they're singing I Want to Hold Your Hand a few months earlier. So the idea is that in terms of teenage girls, they're supposed to be fairly innocent, I think.
I know what you're saying, but there are some bits where it is sexualized a tiny bit, but like not obviously. So unless you're like sort of analysing it, you wouldn't really notice them. But there were a few little things like, oh, she's going to show me a stamp collection. He goes off. It's clear that he's strongly hints that he's going to have sex with her. And then obviously there's the bit where they go to chat with the schoolgirls. And I think he does another Coke reference there as well.
And he does his whole thing in front of Patty Boyd, doesn't he, with the handcuffs, pretending he's in handcuffs.
Yeah. I know what you're saying. They were very aware of what their audience was at that time. But it did have a very British humour at the same time. He was fantastic. I forgot his name. You'll know. The guy that played it, that was in Steptoe and Son, Paul's clean granddad.
Yeah, Wilfred Bramble, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, superb. Really good. And a lot of people may not know that the thing about the clean old man, Americans, for example, might not even know this now, but he was in Steptoe and Son. And the line was, "You dirty old man." His son would say to him. I mean, I didn't clock that for years. I don't know how I missed that myself. The other bit, actually, which is, you might say, acting, one of the most iconic scenes is when they go out the fire escape.
Yeah.
And they frolic in the field to Can't Buy Me Love. And again, there's aerial views and so forth. In fact, just a little bit of trivia. If you watch some of that, I think John wasn't available on one of the days. So some of it's all four. But the bit where they come out the field, there's only three of them.
Oh, I didn't know.
Go back and watch that. Yeah, it's interesting. And obviously, when you take an aerial view of them frolicking, that's kind of acting, because you don't imagine the Beatles in real life would have frolicked in a field.
No.
But they're playing these characters who, like the Beatles themselves, are hemmed in all the time. There is a kind of seriousness to the film, only in that it's showing you how everybody wants a piece of them the whole time.
Yeah.
So them frolicking in a field, they would have said, "Oh, can you frolic in a field?" And that's them acting, really, because, like I say, I don't think they would have done that in real life. Have you got anything else on Hard Day's Night?
Just it lived up to how like it did a tongue-in-cheek version of probably how the lives were, like a train in a room and a car in a room. And I liked the bit how people in the industry were treating stars at that time. I think it's the scene with George, and he goes, "Oh, can he talk?" It's like very tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, can he talk? Yeah. George has a nice scene on his own. He plays it really well, because he plays himself as quiet and quite simple. And of course, they are playing, again, if we want to stereotype a bit, northern working class men. They're all playing up their accents. That's the other thing. I think in almost everything we're talking about here, John is playing up his Scouse accent a little bit. Sometimes outrageously and sometimes just subtly.
There was another interesting line, which was, because a lot of the early stuff, because we know obviously his whole life, you see little things that then relate to later part of his life. And he says in it, once you're over 30, you're past it. And he used to say that in a lot of interviews. I don't want to still be doing this when I'm 30. So maybe that got ingrained in his brain, that line, because he must have referenced that at least in 4 or 5 interviews.
Yeah, I don't want to be singing She Loves You when I'm 30. Yeah, and of course there's a bit of social commentary. As we said, the scene on the train with a guy who could be a war veteran or he's a city banker or whatever he is. And there are lots of references to age. So again, they are promoting youth. And they're playing probably slightly younger than they actually are. Ringo and John were 23.
23,
it's early 64, isn't it? Yeah. Paul would have been 21, 22, and George was just 21, because they were filming it, I think, around March, April. Right, next we're going to move on to John Lennon's first 2 appearances on the TV show Not Only But Also, which obviously with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. Now, the first 2 we're going to look at, they were both, I think, filmed on the same day in November 64. The first one, this is really interesting. I think they filmed it early in the morning, and rather like Ringo on the riverbank in Hard Day's Night, I'm wondering whether John Lennon bothered going to bed or whether he just reported for work at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. or whatever, still on a night out. Just briefly, they walk and they ride on bikes. Norm's got a flat cap. It's Norman Rossington who was in A Hard Day's Night, which is a very kind of working man thing, the flat cap. Yeah. Norm pushes John on a swing. Again, it's a little bit like the Beatles frolicking around. It's also quite similar to what that thing called the Running, Jumping, Standing Still film, which Richard Lester directed. And Dudley Moore's reciting John Lennon's poem, Deaf, Dead, Danuta and Me. What do you think about that one?
What I thought about that is Wimbledon Common, isn't it? They cycle over a fence as well or something, don't they?
Something like that, yeah.
I watched it again today to try and refresh my memory of it. And I think it looks really cool. You know, the black and white, it just adds to it. And I think with it being early in the morning, it looks like quite misty and everything. And yeah, Deaf, Ted, Danuta and Me, I had to Google that, so I couldn't make out what they were saying when they mentioned it.
We read stuff later, but it sounded like Dudley Moore doing the voiceover.
Yeah.
It didn't sound like John Lennon. We sort of Deaf, Ted, Danuta and Me.
Poetry and music. This uneasy marriage of the arts has caused a lot of controversy for a long time. Many opinions are for, many against. We leave you to judge for yourselves. What we're going to show you is a visualization and musification of a poem of a young poet, John Lennon. And the poem is called, quite simply, Deaf, Ted, Danuta and Me.
With faithful frog beside us, big, mighty club are we. The battle scab and frisky dyke, Deft Head, Danuta, and me. We fight the baddies for colour, race, and creed. For Negro, Jew, and Bernie, Deft Head, Danuta, and me. For Billy Groves and Burnley 10, and Aston Villa 3, we blubber ever gallant. And me. So if you hear a wondrous sight and blutter or at sea, remember the mighty say, Deft Head, Danuta, and me.
And the whole way he's saying it is quite funny. It's a fairly nonsensical sketch in a way.
A lot of those books are very nonsensical, aren't they?
Yeah, but there's a lot of social commentary in the books. I don't know if there's social commentary in this sketch.
It was like typical Lennon. He sort of plays it straight. He's playing on words again, and he gets like Adolf Hitler, for example. He gets the name deliberately wrong. It's like very typical of Lennon's sort of little stories and poems.
Talking about when he's reading them out later, or the Wimbledon Common bit.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting muddled up. On the same show, he does a poem later, doesn't he?
Yeah, we'll just get to that in a sec. But this Wimbledon Common, it's quite nice. I mean, Norman Rossington, I think I was asking you a second ago about what it's like acting with people who aren't strictly actors. Norman Rossington obviously has a great rapport with them. You know, I don't know if he's from Liverpool, is he? Is he from Liverpool?
Obviously, on Hard Day's Night, they got to know each other, and I think they invited him onto the show because they thought it'd be good value and sort of hit it off with him.
Yeah, and I think Peter Cook and John Lennon were good friends. They used to go to dinner and stuff together. The Beatles actually met Norman Rossington in 1962 when he opened a bowling alley in Liverpool, which is quite random.
Oh, really?
He was a celebrity, and I think maybe they got his autograph or something. I don't know if they talked much then, but yeah, he was very good. Not to go back to Hard Day's Night, but I think everyone was very well chosen. Obviously, the director, Dick Lester, and I'm saying there's a bit of Dick Lester in that running, jumping, standing still film.
Yeah.
Right at the end of this Def, Ted, Danuta and Me, they say, sometimes we bring our friend Malcolm, and this guy just randomly appears. So there's lots of random, which I love. You know, it's all...
It's very random.
And everyone's playing along with it. That's the thing. And then later on, we get a bit more John Lennon, John reading from his book. So what about that?
Yeah, that's typical Lennon. That's the bit I mentioned then. He plays it really straight. If I remember rightly, he's just looking straight ahead and reading this really weird sort of story with an expressionless look on his face.
Yeah.
And it's almost gibberish, but he delivers it in, I would say he carries it off, and it comes across as unstoppable at that stage, 1964, I think. And it's very Monty Pythonish as well, I feel like. The bizarreness of it. The story, it's the wrestling dog, isn't it? And
the wrestling dog, and there's a bit of acting going on.
Yeah,
good dog Nigel. Yeah, I mean he's brilliant. I wrote down stoned immaculate because he does look, again, he looks a bit high, but he's kind of really carrying it off. And in 65, he looked great. You know, I know he'd put on a bit of weight. You know, he sort of fat shamed himself in later years, didn't he? But I think he just looked amazing. I think I love the 65 hair.
66 is my favourite, followed by 65. I think he looks his coolest.
I don't know. He just carries it off as a kind of, again, I'm going to keep saying working class because the way he's delivering, the way his accent is, you know, he's just putting on a little bit more Scouse than I think was his real accent. Because I actually spoke to Rod Davis in episode 3 of the podcast 6 years ago. And he said, you know, you didn't have a Scouse accent in Wilton. And that's where John grew up, even though he did spend his first 5 years in the Penny Lane area. But, you know, if you think about in song as well, Polythene Pam, you know, he's doing that as well. Get a dose of air and Jack boots and kilt.
She's killer diller when she's at the hilt. She's a kind of a girl that makes an use of the will. Yes, you could say she was attractively built.
Sometimes he sounds very well spoken and almost bordering on posh, and then he sounds broad Scouse. And then when he moved to America, he almost had an American twang, so his accent changes a lot as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And then when he was maybe during the LSD period, he sort of developed. Oh yeah, really great, you know, 1967.
Yeah, even the tone changed. Yeah,
it did. You're right. But the lines are great. I mean, I was bored on the 9th of October, which is, to me, when I hear that, I always think he's making a comment on how he finds life boring. Because George Martin said John found normal life boring. That's why he was always looking for magic all the time. When the Nasties were still booming us. At the time he was writing the book, or probably went back to when he was at school, I'm sure that would have been spontaneous. You know, he just had that way of twisting the language. Just so people know, the romantic thing about John Lennon's birth was that he was born during an air raid, but apparently wasn't. Mark Lewison said, "Oh, sorry to burst everyone's bubble," but he wasn't. But the idea, the Nasties were still booming us. I think delivering his own lines, quote unquote, I think he's comfortable, you know, reading from his own book.
Yeah, well, he used to, at school, he used to write comic sketches, didn't he? So it was something he'd done from a young age. And I think when he was very young in Walton, he used to read like books really for adults. So he was very confident at that type of thing.
Yeah, because on one of my other podcasts, Life and Life Only, I do a lot of episodes where I'm reading from something and then interjecting. And I much prefer it when I'm reading from something that I've written myself. It's just more familiar, obviously, you know, the words. But it just feels more comfortable than reading from somebody else's book. So I don't know.
You know exactly how you want the delivery to be, don't you? It's your work, so you just feel naturally more comfortable doing it.
What kind of things do you write, by the way? You're saying you're
that's how I actually got into acting. I write sitcom scripts, and I just wanted a small role in my own show. I loved acting at school, but I never did it at GCSE, so I forgot about it. I just thought it was something other people did. I write sitcom scripts, and one got commissioned for pilots. There were like quite a few famous people in it. It went on Sky Arts and Now TV, but it never got a series. And I wanted a tiny role in my own show, but the person in charge said, no, it doesn't work like that. You have to learn how to act. So she recommended an acting class, some acting schools. And then I just did it with the sole purpose of being in this show. And then it just led on to me doing acting. But yeah, I just write comedy scripts. I don't write novels or anything like that.
I just had a vision of John Lennon post 1980 writing his own script. That would be great, because I think his acting would be much better if he'd written the lines himself.
Did you say you would have liked to think that he would have been capable of writing a novel rather than a short story?
Yeah, something a bit more long form. I think he would admit that he had attention span problems. And there's a couple of stories in the one that came out called Skywriting by Word of Mouth, which he didn't release. It was released in 86, obviously after he died. And there's a couple of stories at about 5 pages, and they're not particularly good. They're not particularly profound or anything. Yeah, I'd like to think so, you know. Maybe as he got older, his attention span would have maybe improved a little bit.
Maybe. You never know, because like we've already discussed, he changes so much all the bloody time. You never know where you are with it. But I think he just struggled to keep his concentration with writing a long story. But who knows? Like you said, it sometimes gets frustrating when you're doing this show, because and how he bloody contradicts himself and changes his mind all the time.
He's kept the show going, probably on the grave, Well, if you think about it, I mean, even his songs are often bits of 3 or 4 songs he's been working on. So in a sense, even in a 2-3 minute pop song, he's often not writing it straight off. You know, he's taking 30 seconds and thinking, oh, maybe I can use that. It takes 30 seconds from somewhere else. It's really interesting. Never thought of that.
You just remind me of another contradiction of him. People always say, oh, he's so honest. He's so honest. And I think he's honest in the fact that how he feels at that time, he conveys it. But also he's not honest because he'll say, oh, I was lying.
Yeah, of course.
So he is honest in a sense, but also he isn't. So again, it's like fascinating behaviour, but he contradicts himself all the bloody time, like you said.
There's something just came in my mind that we hadn't planned to talk about, but I'll just mention it very briefly in passing. In 1980, when he's doing all those double fantasy interviews, that's acting, because he's saying, I didn't write any music for 5 years. And I still say he's playing this role. John and Yoko are playing this role of, you know, they're madly in love and everything. Maybe they were, I don't know, I wasn't there. But I think there's a certain amount of protecting yourself if you're a famous person as well, that you do have to take on a persona of some kind.
Well, what's interesting about John Lennon is, I think why we all, well, the fans of his love him, is he was so brutally honest in the sense that whatever mood he was in at the time, that's what you got in the interview. So if he was in a foul, angry mood, he didn't put up any walls. It just all came out. If he was in a happy mood, you'd get the enthusiastic John full of life. If he was in an angry mood, you'd get the hateful John. And a lot of people don't do that. Like you said, they protect themselves.
I think he protects himself sometimes, but sometimes he just couldn't help being who he was that day. And in the book, The Art and Music of John Lennon by Peter Doggett, he actually talks about the last 3 interviews, 5th of December, 6th of December, and 8th of December, that he's 3 different people in those.
Yeah.
You know, with Andy Peebles, he just completely charmed Andy Peebles. Both of them did. And Andy Peebles wouldn't hear of the fact that they weren't madly in love or anything, even though he felt that he'd been duped later on. He did an interview, albeit with the Sun, so believe that if you will. But he said, I feel like I've been duped. They were putting on a brilliant performance. Yeah. I think in May Pang's book, they talk about they had a terrible row or something, and then she heard him on the radio about an hour later promoting Walls and Bridges and couldn't believe how like amazingly together he sounded. Like that row just absolutely not happened. Like he was good at compartmentalizing. That's something we discovered.
We come along on Saturday morning, greeting everybody with a smile.
John and Yoko, it is more than wonderful to be able to talk to you after a very, very long time. We've been reminiscing just before the tape started rolling.
Right.
And John, you've been talking about Saturday Club, so the memory is still working.
Oh, the memory is very, very good. It gets better when you get older, actually. It gets more clear.
You remember those glorious
Bernie
days?
Andrews, and I was just saying, I heard some of the tracks. Somebody must have pirated them, Bernie, in America, you know. I've heard Saturday Clubs. We did a lot of tracks that were never recorded on record for Saturday.
End of part 1.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.